Most people think the self is who they are. Their personality, their memories, their likes, their dislikes, their wounds and habits. But if that were true, why does the self feel so unstable? Why can it change so drastically depending on who you're around? Why does it break under pressure? Why does it collapse in grief, inflate in praise, shrink in shame, and constantly need to be defended? Because what you call the self is usually not what you are. And the moment that starts becoming clear, life begins to feel very different. Not because you become someone new, but because you stop mistaking movement for identity. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between the monad and the self. And this is not what most people think it is. This is not a battle between your higher self and your lower self. This is not about destroying your personality. This is not about becoming empty, emotionless, or detached from life. It's much simpler than that. The self is the structure you learn to move through life with. The monad is what remains before and beyond that structure. And if you don't see the difference, you will spend your whole life trying to fix and perfect something that was never stable to begin with. But once you do see it, something relaxes. Because you stop trying to become real through what was only temporary. The self most people know is built. It is shaped through conditioning. You are given a name, a role, a history, a set of expectations, ways you were rewarded, ways you were rejected, things you learned to hide, things you learned to perform. And over time, these patterns got woven together into a sense of me. And because you've been living through that structure for so long, it feels personal. It feels like identity itself. But look closely. The self is always adjusting. It changes depending on who you're with. It hardens when threatened. It performs when watched. It retreats when wounded. It compares, protects, explains, and reacts. That doesn't make it evil. It makes it unstable. The self is functional. It helps you to navigate the world. But it is not the deepest truth of what you are. It is the costume consciousness learned to move through in life. And the problem begins when you think the costume is the wearer. The monad is not a better version of the self. This is where people get confused. They imagine the monad as some perfected identity, some enlightened personality, some spiritual image of themselves with all the mess removed. But the monad is not an improved self-image. It's not a concept. It's not a role. It's not a personal storyline upgraded with sacred language. The monad was never constructed in the first place. It does not depend on memory. It does not depend on mood. It does not depend on approval. It does not become more real when you feel peaceful or less real when you feel lost. It is the quiet, indivisible reality that remains before the mind starts dividing life into me and my experience. You do not create it. You do not earn it. You do not build it through effort. You notice it when the constant pressure to maintain yourself begins to loosen. The monad is not another version of you to achieve. It is what has been here the entire time, while every version of you came and went. The self feels heavy because it must constantly be maintained. It has to keep the story going. It has to defend the image. It has to make sense of the past. It has to predict the future. It has to prove worth. It has to avoid humiliation. It has to stay in control. This is why so many people are exhausted, even when nothing dramatic is happening. They are not only living life, they are carrying a psychological structure every moment of the day and trying to keep it intact. Every interaction becomes loaded. Every mistake feels personal. Every opinion feels threatening. And every loss feels like identity damage. That's the burden of living as the self. Not because the self is bad, but because anything constructed has to be constantly reinforced. And eventually, life starts exposing that instability. You go through heartbreak, through failure, through disappointment, through burnout, in a strange period where your old motivations stop working. And suddenly, the self doesn't feel as solid as it used to. That moment is uncomfortable, but it's also sacred. Because what feels like losing yourself is often the first crack in what was never truly you. Realization usually doesn't begin with a mystical vision. It begins in ordinary moments. A moment where you almost react, but something in you sees the reaction before it takes over. A moment where you feel shame rise up, but you notice it instead of becoming it. A moment where the mind starts narrating who you are, what went wrong, what this means about you. And suddenly, you see that narration happening. That gap matters, because in that moment, something deeper than the self is present. Not as a thought, not as a belief, but as direct recognition. You start to see that the self is appearing within awareness. It is not the source of awareness. You can watch insecurity come and go. You can watch anger form and dissolve. You can watch identities activate in certain situations and disappear in others. What sees all of that is not trapped inside of it. This is where the difference between the monad and the self becomes real. The self is what appears. The monad is the underlying wholeness in which it appears. And when this becomes lived, rather than merely understood, the obsession with defending yourself begins to weaken. You still function. You still have a personality. You still make choices. But now, there is space. And in that space, life stops feeling like a nonstop identity emergency. A lot of people hear this kind of teaching and swing too far. They think the goal is to erase the self completely, but it's not. You don't need to destroy your personality. You don't need to suppress your humanity. You don't need to reject your preferences, your style, or your story. The self is not the enemy. The mistake is identification. The problem is not that the self exists. The problem is that you confuse it for your essence. When that confusion softens, the self can finally take its proper place. It becomes a tool instead of a prison, a way of expressing through life instead of a false center you must constantly protect. You stop asking the self to give you permanence. You stop asking the mind to give you wholeness. You stop asking identity to solve the ache that only truth can dissolve. And from there, life becomes simpler. Not because all problems vanish, but because the deepest part of you is no longer entangled in every passing form. The self can move. The self can change. The self can heal. The self can mature. But the monad was never damaged by any of it. So, the monad versus the self is not really a conflict. It's a confusion. The self is the structure. The monad is the reality. The self is shaped by life. The monad is prior to every shape. The self changes constantly. The monad doesn't come and go. And this is why the search for identity never fully satisfies. Because no matter how refined the self becomes, it still cannot become the wholeness that you already are. That is why this isn't what you think it is. This is not about becoming someone better. It's about recognizing what has never depended on becoming at all. And once that begins to register, even faintly, you start living differently. Less defended. Less performative. Less trapped in the pressure to maintain a false center. Not because you have figured yourself out completely, but because you have begun to notice that what you are is deeper than every version of yourself the mind can describe. If this journey spoke to you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone ready to experience life beyond thought. Comment below. Have you been mistaking your self-image for what you really are? I read every comment. If you would like to support my work directly, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/MagnumOpus333. Or you can explore some original merchandise at my Teespring store online. The link is in the description below. Remember, your consciousness is the key that unlocks reality. Let's keep unlocking it together. Thank you for watching. Until next time.